Welcome to the Herpcore History podcast, presented to you by Little Shop of Horrors. Feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms for any of your feeder needs. All right, let's go ahead and get into this episode. All right, tonight I am joined by Mr. Mark Wise. He was gracious enough to come on here and talk with me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Excellent. Well, where'd you grow up at?
I grew up in a little town north of Charlotte, North Carolina called Kannapolis. And a lot of people know Kannapolis because that's where Dale Earnhardt, the famous race car driver, was from. And his whole family grew up there. And sort of, I guess, NASCAR racing started up there. And it was a little mill town. It's sort of disappeared over the years and has come back.
Excellent. And so getting in, when did you find an interest in reptiles and when did that start for you?
Now, that's hard to say. It's sort of ironic that when I was a little boy, I was close to my sister. And I can remember probably one of the first times I ever saw a snake. I actually ran the other way, just as girls do, because my dad, my uncle, and my parents had gone out blackberry picking, and they came out of the woods with a copperhead hanging on a stick. And I can still remember that vision of them coming, and everybody was saying "run." So, of course, being a little boy, I ran, and little did I know that one day I would. Rattlesnakes and copperheads would be some of my favorite reptiles.
Yes, sir. Yeah. It's kind of funny how, yeah, there's that kind of divergence there where some people, those moments are the ones that kind of shape their life and they're terrified about them for forever. And then some people that end up with a fascination there. And so it was something that you were around from a very young age. I assume, it sounds like you guys were going out, picking berries out in nature. Did that quickly lead into you going and doing child field herping at that point?
Well, not really. I was always interested in nature. Growing up in a house with my parents, loving birds and wildlife, and we go on vacation and go to the zoo, and like everything, would always want to go to the reptile house. And everybody says, "Oh, I'm afraid of reptiles," but that's the first thing they do is go to the reptile house at the zoo. And
Yeah.
so that's I got interested in them like that, but it wasn't really till my teen years that's when I really started getting interested in them, and
Gotcha.
I started reading about them, and I don't really know what sort of turned the page, and I can't define that time when that happened. That I saw the light. Let's say I saw the light,
Yeah.
but it was it was just fun because growing up in North Carolina in the small town that I did, nobody had snakes as a hobby. It was sort of a taboo thing. Only the weirdos had snakes back then. It seemed like growing up in the Piedmont of North Carolina. But I started reading about them, and I found out when I went to school, the teacher would be talking about history, and I'll have a copy of Ditmars stuck behind the textbook, reading Ditmars while they were talking. And then I got a little bit older, and then I started reading Caulfield's book. And as a matter of fact, when I was growing up in Kannapolis, I read Caulfield's book so much that one time when I was at the alligator farm in San Augustine, I came home to North Carolina, and they found out I was there. And my high school called me and asked me if I'd come over to the school and the library, and they had a little ceremony, and they gave me the copy of Snakes and Snake Hunting, and they signed it and discarded the book permanently, and they did an article in the newspaper. So not only did I get the book that I loved growing up, but it was a big deal to my high school.
That's so cool. That's so cool to get, recognized for that and to have that moment. That's
Oh yeah,
that's
yeah,
very cool.
it was. I still have that book, of course, and got a picture of the librarian presenting it to me, and ironically, she wrote a note in there, says one day maybe whenever you do a book, you can bring one back to the library. But by the time I had written some chapters in the first book, she was long gone, and then everybody was long gone by that time. So,
Yeah.
of course, now they don't have libraries much anymore. They don't have the good old books like we had when we were reading coming along.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that definitely, early on and trying to get an understanding of reptiles and what the hobby was like. Today we're so spoiled with so many resources, but early on they weren't there, and so having those books available to you, um, a lot of people didn't have that, and so that's super cool.
Yeah, now I have like 10 copies of Snakes and Snake Hunting. So if I find something I'm really interested in, I go overboard buying those books and everything too.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, it
But
makes sense.
but when I was growing when I was growing up, there was sort of funny. There was a man that owned a dairy bar in Kannapolis. It was called Cobb's Dairy Bar, and he had a little grill and ice cream, and it was like a place that everybody in Kannapolis used to go there and get milkshakes and everything. So when I was a young teen, Mr. Cobb asked me one day, he said, "Would you mind coming and doing a snake show at the store?" And he was really interested in what I was doing. And I said, "Yeah, I think so." So he printed these big posters up and had signs hanging up in the window. Said he called it something like Mark Wise Live Snake Expert. I was 14 or 15 years old. So, I really knew a lot as a 14-year-old. Just kidding, of course. So he had a sign hanging up and it said Live Snake Show. Had it hanging in the window, had ads in the newspaper. So some lady shows up at the dairy bar and she was disappointed. She got there. She thought they were making milkshakes. She didn't realize that it said live shakes. And I can still see the look on that woman's face. And so it was sort of disappointment, sort of disappointment from the beginning. So my knowledge of reptiles and sort of local, you know, not celebrities, not the right word, but word of me being a reptile person. Everybody would call me Snake Man at school, and going to the senior picnic, they found a snake over in the kitchen, so they made an announcement for Snake Man to come to the kitchen. So I knew what they wanted, and I got there, and it was about a 5 foot black rat snake in the kitchen. So everybody knew my hometown still today, still know that. And I don't know
Yeah.
if you remember the old snake movie that there was cut like the S's and it was and there was the snake movie from '73. One of my friends was his name was Bobby Harmon. He was in the movie theater working there as a teenager, and he invited me. He said, "You ought to come and see this movie." So I ended up watching it, I think 9 times. And so he stole the poster out of the lobby and gave it to me. I still have it hanging on the wall in my office here.
That's super cool.
And yeah, that was those were some fun times back there, and I didn't realize how much fun it was back then.
Yeah. Well, that's something that another guest in the past brought up, Mr. Jeff Adams, was the idea about the color of life, and saying as time's gone on, he doesn't think that the younger generation is experiencing as much, the color of life, and I think
Oh
it's
yeah.
interesting, especially hearing stories highlighted like this, where you're going back to your local town and they're making a note to go, hey, this is who you are,
Yeah.
or getting called over the intercom. You don't hear of that as much nowadays. And, it's just an interesting point that there's validity to.
Oh yeah. Well, that's you're talking about that. I'll talk more about Ross Allen later on because Ross and I worked together, and I got to know him as a young adult and work with him in St. Augustine. But I was at a reptile convention. I won't mention the name of it here in Raleigh not long ago, and somebody had an Everglades rat snake in there, and so I said, "Can I see it?" And I picked it up, and I was explaining to him how you tell the difference between the Everglades rat snake and the yellow rat snake. And I said, "Yeah, I used to work with Ross Allen," and they said, "I'm sorry, I don't know who that is." And I said, "Well, do you know the scientific name?" And they said, Yeah, it was a laughy at the time, and I said, when its subspecies is Ross Alleni, and they said, well, I didn't know that. I didn't even know who that is. So, sort of shows you how times have come along.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it definitely has. And it's so funny doing this, I definitely ran into stuff where I bring up people's names and, people that you would assume would know who you're talking about
Oh
don't
yeah.
have an idea. But as I've dorked out more on this and got deeper into this, I'm constantly guilty of it myself. But also, I think it speaks to what's so cool about this hobby is the importance of citizen science in it, and so many people matter and have done something interesting,
Oh yeah.
and it's just a super cool, aspect of the hobby. And so around that age of you being 14, 15, you were getting, asked to come do a presentation on reptiles. I assume you had animals at that time?
Oh yeah. I had some really nice cage set up at my house. Matter of fact, I was in St. Augustine in South Central Florida, and I showed a picture of some of my cages in my bedroom. And said, "Where did you buy those?" And I said, "Well, my dad and I made them because they were a pretty sophisticated setup for a you know mid 1970s kid growing up in North Carolina to have snake cages like that. Matter of fact, I still have them, but I don't have any snakes in them anymore. But I still have them. I think there were 8 or 10 cages built into this bookcase type thing, and it was really pretty neat. And I always had something in there, even if it was a worm snake. And I had some good snakes in there, but fortunately, when I got a little bit older, I was this guy came through town. His name was Randy Gallagher. I'd always wondered what happened to Randy, but he lived over in Albemarle, which is east of Kannapolis. But he had a place. It was a trailer. It was basically a trailer, and he moved from shopping center to shopping center, sort of like the old roadside show. But he called it Metrolina Serpentarium. And this guy had the most unbelievable snakes in there. It was so dangerous. Some of the snakes that he had king cobras and kraits and puff adders and cobras in these cages that, I mean, they were all locked and secure. I learned a lot from that guy that summer when I worked with him. And it just so happened that one time he called me and said, "Hey, I need to go to New York and pick up some snakes that are coming in, and they're going to New York." And he said, "Would you like to go with me?" And I said, "Leo, let me check with my parents. I'm still a young kid." And called my dad. And my dad says, "Oh yeah, yeah, that's fine. Go ahead and go." So we took off at like 7 o'clock on a Friday night and drove all the way to New York to LaGuardia Airport, or was Kennedy? Is one of the two. And we got there, and there were 4 humongous boxes of these very dangerous snakes, and all the way back from New York, the you could hear the puff adders in the boxes hissing, and I mean there were some dangerous snakes. If we'd have run off the road, who knows what would have escaped, between New York and North Carolina. But I learned a lot about venomous snakes working there. I mean, he didn't let me really handle any per se because there were some real dangerous ones, and I wasn't old enough really to be around them. But I had a lot of experiences, and it just so happened there was a guy named Keith Benson. He that worked for Randy, and his nickname was Doc. And he actually got bitten by an Indian cobra working in there one day. I was not there, but he just barely survived. I mean, he was in the hospital for a long, long time, and so he had a tremendous scar on his left arm where the snake had bitten him. And so time went by, and about a year or two later, I saw an article in the paper that he was bitten by a timber rattlesnake of all things, and he had died. And I have had I have no idea whatever happened with Randy Gallagher, or I know what happened to Doc, but I've been unable to track him down over all these years. But I think he would be proud to know that what he taught me, and what I learned from him, and what became of me in my reptile career.
Yes, sir. And how old were you when you were experiencing that? And how old was
I was
Mr. Gallagher?
16. I was 16, 17, somewhere 17 maybe. Sometime around then. So I had a car and could drive, and so I'd go just hang out there. Of course, it was in the summer, so I'd go and just, probably became a nuisance because I was there all the time, but it was always fun. I think he charged people 50 cents or $1 to go in this probably 40-foot trailer. But if anybody grew up around Charlotte, the Charlotte area, probably southern South or northern South Carolina, they probably experienced him coming to the shopping center because he would go set up in different places, and sometimes I'd drive to Charlotte and hang out with him for the day, and but it was fun. I always wondered what happened to him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what an well, okay, back to keeping on track with you, but I don't want to tangent off too much there on my thoughts. Um and so you kind of being at that, was that your first experience with people that were like-minded in what you were doing?
I think directly because again there weren't many people in my hometown. There was a couple of kids that had caught snakes. As a matter of fact, I ended up with one of the biggest king snakes of my life that a guy that I knew in high school had caught, and he had it hid in his bedroom. And his dad knew my dad, and so he said he has a king snake. Can Mark take it? And so fortunately, I went and got it, and it was the biggest king snake I have ever seen. It's just a regular old eastern king snake, and so I got that thing, and I had it. I remember having it during graduation because I got a picture made of me, which I can't find today, of me holding this king snake wearing my tuxedo for my class night at graduation. So I know that was around 1974. It was a humongous snake. I'd love to find that slide or picture.
Yeah. Well, it's so cool too that you seem to have been interested in collecting memorabilia from, taking pictures and doing that. I'm definitely someone that doesn't tend to take pictures of stuff. And so to kind of have the foresight to save these things and to get these things, not until I got older did I start getting interested in more collecting books and reptile art, so
Yeah, when I was in St. Augustine last week, I was talking to my friend Greg Lapira, who worked at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm with me, and we were talking about, man, if we would have had phones back when we were there, we could have had so many pictures because back then you'd take a picture and run it over to the Photoshop and then develop them, and 2 weeks later you get back this fuzzy looking picture. But when I think of all the neat things that I got to do and how many thousands of photos I would have as opposed to the 6 or 7 grainy looking photos that I have today of some neat things.
yeah. I don't know if you've ever experienced this and experienced it in the moment where you're sat there and you have the realization of the moment that you're in and going, try to soak in as much of this as possible because it's fleeting.
Oh yeah.
And that's it's almost a bummer to realize it. But in that moment, just take it all in that you can because it is a unique moment in time.
Yeah. And it is true, and it's funny. The older I get, the more I look back at some of these stories, and I go places, and people say, "I remember when you did that," or somebody will post something on the internet, and it's a photo or something that happened, something that I did, and I didn't recall it. But after I see the photo, I said, "I remember that." And matter of fact, one other thing just happened recently that I'm sort of jumping to the next chapter of my career a little bit.
But
But
we'll double back. That's all good.
okay. But I no, I went back, going on to sort of the next phase, sort of phases of my career. I went to Western Carolina University and I was going to get a degree in geology, which I did. But I got a degree in geology, and so one of the local newspapers made a big deal out of this kid with a degree in geology. They did a big article about me in the newspaper with catching snakes and lifting the lifting the rocks to catch snakes, and they did an article about that. But when I'm sure I'm jumping ahead a little bit more, but we'll again you could go back to it. But when I was in college, when you get a degree in geology, you have to go do field studies, and so I chose to do my field work in the Big Bend National Park at a school called Sul Ross State University, which is in Alpine, which is most people that know, like you, that know the tricolored kings that are out there, is right in the heart of that area. And so I spent a whole summer in at Sul Ross, going all over Van Horn and all the famous places where you can find the subocularis and a lot of the rare snakes. But the funny thing is not long ago, I've been scanning a bunch of my old slides that I have to just so I can look at some of these old pictures. And I'm sure some of my friends are getting tired of me sending these old pictures and stuff because it's, some of them are involved in them. And it's brought me back to some of the old friends that I used to have. But so when I was at Sul Ross, I got a picture of me standing in St. Helena Canyon. I know you know a lot about Big Bend, but it was a picture of me standing in a pair of shorts in St. Helena Canyon, and I was wearing a Nautilus Fitness T-shirt. And so this was 1978. So again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it was in 1978. I was there in July, and wearing this shirt. A month later, I got back to college in North Carolina and walk into my dorm. I go into the mailbox and I get this, you know how it is back in those days. You'd get price lists from different places. And I opened the mailbox and there was a letter in there from this alligator farm in Florida. Here was a North Carolina boy. And I said, what is this? Another price list. So I stuck it in my pocket and went to eat lunch with my buddies and came back, opened the thing up, and the letter was from Ross Allen. And it was Ross had written me a letter, said, we would like for you to come to San Augustine to work at the alligator farm. And I mean, immediately when I saw that, I said, does this really say what I thought it said? It was signed by Ross Allen. And so the ironic thing about this letter, getting a letter a month after being in Big Bend, and then the picture of me with a Nautilus T-shirt on, little would I know that years later, the San Augustine Alligator Farm, we would buy Arthur Jones's collection of reptiles that I was involved in. I was overseeing this whole purchase, that I'd be buying Arthur Jones's collection, and here I was wearing a Nautilus T-shirt, and it sort of circles back to bring all those stories together.
Yeah. And then for anyone that doesn't know, the gentleman you're speaking about is the owner, is the owner of the Nautilus gym equipment. And yeah, for you to have that shirt on, what are the chances? And that's so interesting about just kind of it all falling into place. And so I think it does kind of track with the time frame of where we're at, right? We're around 1974, and you having your picture with your snake, and then going off into college and deciding to do geology. And what made you focus on geology instead of some of the other fields?
Well, it's sort of funny. The back then, the oil business was booming, and when I first started in college, and I just thought, I like nature, and I said, well, that's a great career. I didn't know there was any such thing as a career in working with reptiles. People worked with zoos, and of course, but I didn't know there was a real future in it. But so when I left San Augustine, I said, well, I'm gonna go down there and work for 3 months and just see what it's like and work through the summer. And so I started. I left, graduated from college in December. The day I graduated from college, the next day I was in my little Volkswagen Beetle driving down to meet Ross, and this was in December of 1978. And it was sort of funny because all the, we don't have didn't have the internet like we do today, and you couldn't see instant photos or, all the pictures and books I had seen of Ross Allen were in the 1940s when he was this young man. So I don't remember how this all happened, but I called him on the phone and talked to him, and I told him I'd be in San Augustine. So I was standing in the gift shop at the alligator farm there, and I don't know if you've ever been to San Augustine, but as San Augustine was, as most tourist attractions were, you always exited through the gift shop where you could buy the rubber alligators, the rubber snakes, and the little alligator pinchers for 79 cents. But I was standing there at the door and at the door leading into the alligator farm, and this old man walks up and says, "You're Mark?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he says, "Hi, I'm Ross Allen." And it was a 68-year-old man that, I'd pictured as him being, when you're young and innocent, you picture this guy being a 25-year-old strapping guy. And here this guy comes in with glasses on. And I was, it was like, wow, this is a real eye opener. Because we always picture our heroes being like they were when we saw them and when we grew up admiring what they had done.
Yes. Yeah. No, and that's a good in the moment perspective of that again I think that I can relate with experiencing stuff like that. And it's very deep when you think about it in general. And it's an interesting observation there for sure.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's so cool. And then not, we will move on to you moving to Florida and starting that part of your life, but to jump back just for a second, when you were in Alpine for the time that you were in, you were going around, you were herping. Any experiences stand out from that time frame for you, and anything?
Well, unfortunately, the thing that I realized that I didn't know was a lot of the West Texas herps like that. I thought when everything we learned were in books that not like the books that you get today, where it's sort of instantaneous. I mean, we had Caulfield books and we had Roger Conant's field guides and those types of things, but I thought I knew a lot more than I did when I was there. You go and you see a snake and hmm, what what is that? And you'd have to think about it and try to figure out. The first snake that I ever really recall seeing was a black-tailed rattlesnake, and of course I knew what that was. But there were all kinds of snakes like Big Ben Pat's nose and hook-nosed snakes and those kinds of things. And of course I knew the subocularis and the tricolored kings. But the one thing about it that I did learn while I was there, and I know that's your specialty, is I guess tricolored kings, is and this is something that I learned on my own, was how many variations there were of those snakes.
Yeah.
You'd go one place and they were gray, and matter of fact, one I saw in I think I was in Van Horn or Fort Davis, one of the places that I was going. I'd go to class during the daytime, and as soon as class would get over, fortunately, I knew a girl that was out there, and she had a car, so she was willing to drive me, and we drove to Marfa, and you know, as soon as the sun went down, we'd drive 120 miles a night just going out looking for snakes. And of course, I didn't catch a lot of them just because they were, I've always been real sensitive about not collecting a lot of things. But I remember one time I was out and I said, "Well, there's a rock rattlesnake," and as you know, it was a tricolored king snake, and some of those look just like it. And you have to do a double take. You say, "Well, does it have, you know, what it's like at night when you're
Yes.
out there
Yeah.
with a flashlight?" And you do. There's some of those look just like a rock rattlesnake.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Mm.
It's so funny how a lepidus, which is a unbelievably cool snake when you really think about it,
Oh yeah.
can sometimes be a bummer when you're
Oh
like,
yeah.
oh, I thought it was an alternative for a second. I
Oh yeah.
thought you're so desperate on your, sixth day out there of however many hours of walking where you're just trying so hard to make anything an alterna, and you see that, and it's like, damn it. But
Oh yeah.
it's a really cool snake.
Well, this guy that I ran across out there, there were real cowboys out in West Texas back in those days, and there still are. But there were people that wore cowboy hats and boots, and they were real cowboys. They worked out in the pastures all day and would do roundups, and I mean, it just amazed me. Those farms out there in Big Bend, we would drive from one farm to another, and it'd be a 25-mile trip, and you get out and open the gate to go to the next farm. I don't think people realize how massive West Texas is. And
Yep.
this one guy, I started talking to him there, and he said, "I said, do you ever see a lot of snakes?" He said, "Well, the best place to find a snake, believe it or not, is to find a billboard or a sign. And if you go look on the shady side of it, you'll find a snake in the daytime." And he was right. I found out if you found some place that was like a board or a building, there was usually a snake on the shady side of the building because it gets 100 degrees out there regularly. And but it was sort of funny that the first subocularis that I ever caught, I think the first Baird's rat snake was in the daytime, in a 95-degree day, but it was in the shade.
Wow,
I don't
that's
know if you
super
ever I
cool.
don't know if you ever experienced that or not when you were out there.
Oh, I've never even attempted that. So that, I
Yeah,
mean, that's super cool and
yeah.
super interesting and does make sense that these animals would be looking for shade like that.
And
That's very cool.
there was one place out there that was called Woodward's Ranch, and I've looked it up in line. I want to go back out there again, but it was famous for agates, which is a type of quartz, and this was a big. It was a tourist attraction almost. It was a big farm, but they had a gift shop there, and they sold these dissected rocks that were polished and real colorful, little dendrites in the rocks. But one of my friends went there the week before I did. We sort of alternated our field camps and where we would go from one place to the next. He said, "You got to go to this place on Woodward's Ranch." He said, "I have never seen so many snakes in my life." And he says, "Just go here and take a left." And he's saying it's very isolated out there. People that have never been to Big Bend don't know how wild and rural that place is. But so I walked, and he said, "If you find this stream, you won't believe it." Sure enough, I got there. A red racer was curled up there. But I started walking down this creek, and I have never seen so many garter snakes. It looked like Manitoba walking through there with all the snakes, the garter snakes, black necks and checkered garter snakes. They were everywhere. And I just played around a little bit. I had a bag of some type with me, and I can't tell you how many garter snakes I put in that bag. I released them all, but I must have had 50 garter snakes. Every step I would take, they would crawl out. But they were beautiful, beautiful snakes in West Texas.
Yeah. No, and that's it's such a beautiful region, and even now, while there has been population growth in those areas, and it has changed even from the time that I started going out there, um, it is still very remote and still very wild. And so, hearing about it when you were going back, the time frame that you were out there, um, it was even more remote, and that you know that's super cool. That's
I
super cool.
remember, I remember one time I wasn't prepared, and I saw a hook-nosed snake, and I had never seen one. They're very small. They're real tiny. Only thing they
Yes,
had to
sir.
put it in was a bag where we had a sandwich, and it was a loaf of bread bag with the twist tie on it. And I had to catch it because I wanted to. So I took it back to the dorm with me and looked at it, and turned it loose the next day. But it was just weird because I looked at it and said, "What is that? Is that a hog nose?" At first, and then I looked at it and I picked it up, and sometimes as when you're out there, being out there like you've been and I've been, the roads are so wide in some places. The shoulder of the road is paved just like the middle of the road, so you some of those roads are very, very wide. And
Yes,
so
sir.
you have a good time, a lot of time sometimes to catch something, unless it's something that moves real fast. But you
Yep.
don't you don't want to get off the side of the road and get into the lechugia and those types of things, because those things will eat you up.
Yes. Yeah. I've had many go through a boot and you're like, holy crap.
Oh yeah.
And and for many years, yeah, I rocked 10 ply tires on my Mazda and went out there, and it's a good time. It's a good time.
Right. It
Well,
sure is.
excellent. And so then moving forward again now, right? You're in there, you're in the gift shop, and Ross Allen walks out, and that's the beginning of the next chapter.
It is, and boy, what an experience to be able to spend time with that man. You know, when you look in his eyes, I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to meet him, but
No, sir.
I can only imagine what it was like being at Silver Springs. You know, Ross unfortunately gets a lot of bad publicity for, you know, everybody says, oh, he killed all these snakes and he did this and he did that. But I think if you talk to the real people were around him, there's a lot of people that wouldn't be in the reptile trade. I'm sure if you know, Tom Crutchfield and some of the people that knew Ross, they know that I mean, he brought so many people into the profession. I mean, he might have killed tens of thousands of rattlesnakes, but it was a different time back then. And I don't have a problem with it because, I mean, Florida, it does have issues, but it's not because people killing snakes. It's because there's so many darn people that places that I used to go, and I could go on San Augustine Beach and catch eastern diamondback rattlesnakes now, and there's hotels and restaurants, and the habitat is just gone. And if you go and look at snakes and snake hunting, Caulfield talks about going to Anastasia Island and how many scarlet king snakes he would catch and coach whips and things in San Augustine. But now there's highways and motels and restaurants and you know, a lot of that loss of reptile life, indigos and those types of things are because of there's no place for the poor snakes to live anymore.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, that's
But
something that anytime you're looking at history, we can't. While of course you're going to have the modern lens that you're looking at the situation, and you can see that it was wrong or right or whatever it was, that was that mindset, and it wasn't the reality of the situation in the moment. And so, while the situation might not have been perfect, exactly to your point, that cascading effect led to people like yourself, right, having access to it, and then you leading to the people that you influenced and how they handle it. And it's an evolution to where we are now, the fact that we even think that it was negative. And so you have to have those baby steps, or we wouldn't be where we are now, better or
but
worse.
it's funny though because I've got several friends that are like me that are Ross Allen. I mean, I guess we could call him a Ross Allenite. But when we went last week, I had a good friend of mine. His name's Mike Boyle. He lives down in Florida, and Mike and I went and did a little. I'm gonna jump back to Ross in a little bit, but
Yes,
everywhere
sir. No problem.
we went to Silver Springs, and we went to the Yearling Restaurant, and we went to Marjorie Kennan Rawlings' house, which they're all close to each other. But everywhere I would go, Mike would introduce me and say, "This is Mark, my friend Mark. He used to work with Ross Allen." So that's how, you know, some people just say that's like, I guess saying he played baseball with Babe Ruth, but a lot of people say he used to work for Ross Allen, and it's like a big deal. And you know, you tell them how many things I learned from Ross, and no, to me, everything I learned from him was positive. I mean, I did do some things that were pretty crazy, like petting rattlesnakes on the head 4 or 5 times a day. And you know, after they struck the balloon, I don't know if you've ever seen that before, but that was one of the things that we did. We did reptile and alligator shows 4 to 5 times a day, and dangerous work picking up eastern diamondback rattlesnakes and you know extracting the venom for the crowds, and then we'd put the rattlesnake on the floor and the rattlesnake would strike at the balloon and pop the balloon, and of course the crowd would go crazy because it scared the the crap out of them when the snake struck the balloon and it popped, and then you would reach over and pet the rattlesnake on the head after after that. And of course, Ross would. This thing still brings goosebumps to me when I think about it. But Ross would stand up, and this is what I started doing too later on. Is he said, if you're ever out in the woods and you walk up on one of these guys in the wild, and he curls up and he hisses and he rattles and strikes at you, it's a feeling you'll never forget. And it really is. I mean, if you ever, I don't know if you ever been in Eastern Diamondback. Still today, if I see one, I still get that. It's not nervousness. It's like, man, what an impressive beast.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's definitely even though I've seen, I don't know how many A trucks now, right? Just tons. It's still, if you're not expecting it, it makes you go, whoa,
It
and
does. But I don't think about it as being, like a lot of people would, want to take off running. I don't think of it that way. It's just like, man, how lucky am to see this guy? That's sort of my first reaction.
yeah. Well, especially, I mean, when you think about it, right? That depending on how you plan your herping trips, but regardless, if it's, hey, in 6 months we're going to be here at this time, and what are the chances of that animal being at that spot at the time you're there, and your paths crossing. It's pretty cool when you experience it, and I definitely feel lucky.
Oh yeah, yeah, it is. And not everybody ever sees a rattlesnake in the wild. They see them at the zoo, but I know people that live in Florida that said I've never seen one of those in the wild. And I said, well, you've never been in the wild then if you've never seen one. But it's spectacular.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, so back to Ross. But let me mention one thing for sort of a commercial. Um, David Drisdale is the owner of the San Augustine Alligator Farm, and he's just the greatest person than anybody could ever meet. And the reason I'm bringing this up is David has always been behind the scenes on stuff, but he has supported so many people, crocodilian projects financially, and he just remains behind the scenes. And people that are listening to this that know San Augustine, and a lot of people don't even know who David is or has never heard his name. But people like Tom Crutchfield, for example, I bring up Tom again. There's a lot of people in this reptile industry that owe a lot to David, and especially me, that owe to him so much that he's done to allow research with the University of Florida, people from all over the world that have come there and done research projects, including Kent Vliet, which a lot of people are familiar with Kent for the National Geographic Realm of the Alligator, where he swam with the alligators and did reproductive studies back in the 80s, and most people know Kent from being that. But David supported all these things, and he doesn't get enough credit for what he has done for herpetoculture and especially crocodilian research.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, it's always so interesting how there's so many people that and you hear the names, and then you meet certain people where they're just this quiet, monolith of knowledge or emotion, and it's interesting when you get to meet those people, and I definitely can understand that going like,
And I don't
there's
think a
this
lot of
guy.
people, yeah, I don't think a lot of people have ever met David, but he's a true Southern gentleman, very classy, a great storyteller, but he's really behind the scenes, and hopefully one day he'll get credit for what he has done for especially me and a lot of people in the reptile world. But if it weren't for him, I probably would have. He brought Ross on board, and then Ross brought me. So I owe David as much as I do Ross.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so interesting how those little decisions that people make in their life, one way or the other, right? I mean,
Yeah,
for you to get the letter, crack the letter open, and go, okay, I'm going to do this,
yeah,
and be at a position in your life. You know what I
Oh yeah.
mean? Where I could get a job offer from anybody right now, and it's not really feasible for me to do that. Whatever it was, I'm kind of committed to where I'm at and what I'm doing. And
Yeah.
so
Back
to
to yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, yeah, so yeah, just to be a young man in that moment and get to capitalize on that, and then it cascade into this life. And so, right, you're there, you're in the gift shop, you're moving forward. What's that like? And then, I mean, obviously, we're seeing what it turned into, but in that moment,
Well, I'm sort of going to jump ahead just a little bit, but I want to tell one story that a lot of people think is sort of interesting. Was my first day at the alligator farm, maybe the second day. It had to have been the second day. I was there, and Ross looked at me. I don't know if people know a lot about Ross's personal life, but he loved women, and women loved Ross. I mean, he was married numerous times, and he was just a handsome guy. Even at 68, he, when 68, 69, 70, the time that I know him, and of course he died at 71. But he just had this captivating look in his eyes. You could look in his eyes and they just twinkled when you talked to him. So he told me one day, he says, Mark, I'm going to go up to the South Seas restaurant and eat. He said, do you have a girlfriend? And I said, no, I don't. I said, as you know, Ross, I just moved here yesterday. And he says, we got to find you a girlfriend. And Ross's wife was Gail, and she was a younger woman than Ross. And he said, why don't you come up at the South Seas restaurant, his little restaurant north of the alligator farm. He said, after you finish whatever you're doing, come on up there and meet me. So here I walk into the South Seas restaurant, and there's Ross sitting at the table with this woman. And I said, I walk in, and Ross introduced me. He says, I want to introduce you to my friend. This is Mark, and he introduced me to this girl. To this day, I don't know her name. And so Ross gets up and has to go to the bathroom, and as all 68-year-old men, he had to go to the bathroom several times. But he got up and asked the girl. I said, "Where did you meet Ross?" And she said, well, "I really didn't know who he was." She said, "I was walking up Anastasia Boulevard, and this guy pulls over in his little station wagon. He had drove a Toyota station wagon, and said, would you like to have lunch with a friend of mine?" And so that was my first introduction to Ross, and how, he would say what he wanted. And this girl, she said, I had never met him before. He just wanted to know if I wanted to have lunch with a friend. And so that's how that started. And of course, people always want to know what happened. I said, well, I can't even tell you the girl's name. I was so embarrassed after that. I think went back to I went back to work. So
that's fair. That's fair. Especially being
yeah.
blindsided by that. Yeah.
Oh
No.
yeah. But Ross, the funny thing about Ross, there's so many good stories about him that are not, written in books, and just funny things. And some of the things that I acquired from him, and when I look back and think about things that Ross had brought, he after he left Silver Springs, he left there. ABC bought him out, and so he went to work at Sarasota Jungle Gardens, and then he was there briefly, and then St. Augustine brought him up there to head up the reptile shows at the alligator farm. But I was so lucky when I was there, and today I could kick myself when I think about this, because I have a tremendous Ross Allen collection. Matter of fact, I probably have one of the biggest collections in the world of Ross Allen stuff. And he produced a lot of pamphlets with Wilfred Neal about the Reptile Institute and taxidermy and catching rattlesnakes and just fun stuff. But I was able to acquire some of the things he personally made me, probably about 3 months after I was there, a small snake hook for handling eastern diamondback rattlesnakes. He surprised me one day, and it was a little hook, and it's only about 12 inches long. It's an old broom handle with a bent piece of wire in it, like a paint roller size wire that he put in there, and he signed it, to Mark from Ross Allen. And so, of course, that's a prized possession. I have that. You can't hardly read his name on there anymore because it's was written in ballpoint pen. But I have it in a dark box where the writing won't fade anymore. But Ross had tremendous scrapbooks in his office. If you ever go to San Augustine, his office was in the upstairs little. There's a little nook up in the top, and that's where his office was. But there must have been 50 scrapbooks in there, basically his life and all the newspaper articles and some of the things that he had done were just fascinating. You know, he doubled for Johnny Weissmuller, and there were all these pictures of Johnny Weissmuller, and he when he was when he would do all the underwater stunts for Weissmuller, and just I can't even recall how many pictures were in there that I have never ever seen those pictures published anywhere before of large cottonmouths and coral snakes that were extraordinary. Because you know when Ross was going through Florida, it was rural back in the 20s, and he would
Yes, sir.
find these large things. And um, but just thinking back about some of the things that he had there that came from Silver Springs, like old signs, and there's a famous sign that you see it from time to time. It's the headline is "Wanted Live Snakes," and you don't very see them very often. I have one of them, but he had a whole stack of them left from Silver Springs. And when I think back about it, if I'd have asked him, Ross would have probably said, "Oh, you can take all those if you want." But there was a life size cutout of Ross, like mounted on a piece of plywood, with his hand out like he's shaking hands. And I guess it used to be in the old pioneer log cabin when you walked into Silver Springs, and that was just sitting there out in the weather in St. Augustine. And the old red boxes that he would catch rattlesnakes in, and they just a 3x2 wooden box. There were probably 6 or 8 of them there that he had brought over from Silver Springs, and he offered me one of them. And unfortunately, I was a 21-year-old kid with a 1 bedroom apartment, and he said, "If you want one, you can have it." And like an idiot, I didn't take it because I didn't have room for it. And it made me sick last week when I was at Silver Springs. They've got one on exhibit, and they're just like the ones that was he had offered me. But you know, when you work with somebody like that, that famous in herpetology, I look back at all these pictures I see and everything that, the hours and hours I spent with Ross. That I say, well, why didn't I have him sign that, or why didn't I do this? And I guess it's just being with somebody every day and working with them. But it was fortunate that he gave me a copy of Adventures with Reptiles and signed it, and so I do have that. But unfortunately, as life goes on, I spend more money on the internet buying things that belong to Ross that I probably could have had some of these things for free. That some things that people don't even know exist that I have.
Yeah. Well, it's just those, again, it's being in that moment. And, the person themselves, they don't necessarily look at themselves in that light, right? And so it's just their junk to them. And then when they're gone, it's those things that you find the most interest in. And I can relate, people are still around, but that's why I have an old snake rack in my garage where I'll never use it, but it's pretty cool that they
Oh yeah.
made this. I can understand and relate with that for sure.
Well, I've got a thing up in my office. I've got 2 offices at my house, and one, and but I've got some things in there that people would love to see. But one thing that I do have that one of my prized possessions was when I started at the alligator farm. Ross had a mailbox there, and it had his name on it. It was made out of old wood paneling, but Ross had written his name on the mailbox. And when I started there, somebody went and wrote my name on there just above Ross's name. It's just a little wooden, like a slot, basically. So fortunately, I I have that box still, and I have it in my office. But it's a real prized possession, and just having the mailbox that who knows what letters came in that mailbox that belonged to Ross and stuff that came to me that probably some of the stuff just got thrown in the trash.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I'm,
it's
a matter of
too.
fact, I have a chair that Ross used to have in his office, and it's in my office, and it's I've had several people that have found out about it, and everybody wants to buy it, of course, but it's not for sale.
Yeah. Yeah, it's priceless to you, and that's so cool. And especially, to have something like that where, I think the symbolism behind your name being written on the mailbox as as a, a proof of your moment in time there, and that how integral you were, So that makes sense. I
But
appreciate
unfortunately,
that.
fortunately, I'm 21 years old, 22 years old at the time, and maybe 23, later on. He, when I think back about it, his son Tommy, who was on Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins. One day, Ross asked me. He said, "I'm going to go over to Tommy's. Has a scuba diving store that he's opening over in Gainesville." So he said, "Do you want to go with me?" And of course, I said, "Sure, I'll go with you." I mean, I didn't have any idea what I was getting into, and I'd love to have a video of that whole day because we drove over, and of course, Ross drove a little Toyota Cressida station wagon. This, the last thing you'd picture, you picture Ross driving a Jeep with, safari stuff written all over it, but it was a little Toyota Cressida wagon. But Ross, even at those days, he would catch little animals and he'd put them in his car. Like you'd get in there sometimes and there'd be a dead animal laying on the dash that he had caught and just put it in there. But we rode over and spent the whole day and went over to his son's store, and Ross was going to be there to make a personal appearance. And we went over to Payne's Prairie, which is it's near Gainesville, but it's a beautiful preserve. And a lot of people that are into preservation wouldn't want to hear this story, but we drove down through Payne's Prairie and we got off the road and pulled over. And he said, in 19, I forgot what year he told me it was, but he said, I caught over 450 snakes on this road. And it's a beautiful natural area, but the habitat there is still very, very natural. But just some of the stories that he told me, I could almost see back in the day when he would have done that.
Yep.
But I'm an avid collector of Ross Allen stuff. Matter of fact, I'm going back to Florida next month. They're having a big memorabilia show down there for history, and there'll always be some Ross Allen pennants or something that I don't have, and I'm still looking for a couple of things to. I shouldn't say complete my collection. I got three things in the mail today that I had found on the internet that I spend more money than I probably should have on these things, but it's what makes me happy.
Well, it's so cool, and again, another level to the hobby where it's a whole nother aspect to this hobby, which is what makes it so cool, is how multifaceted it is, and while adjacent, still very much so in line with it, and that's cool. I like to hear it.
Yeah, but but it's just so much fun, and people that knew Ross personally, and I mean all through his life, is you meet people all the time said, "Oh, I went to Ross. I saw him do a show when I was a little boy," and even people that aren't even interested in reptiles, Ross was the attraction in Florida before Mickey Mouse came along, and Silver Springs was the attraction, and Ross was a big part of bringing people to Silver Springs. I want to tell you, this is a story about Ross later on in life. Would you rather me wait till later and tell the? I mean, he was dead at this time, but I'll tell you that story later on.
Okay.
So
Well, I mean, I know that you had some points that you had listed, and so kind of where we're at in your story. If there's some stories that you want to hit where you go, hey, this should be brought up and this should be brought up, feel free
yeah,
to go off those, and
okay.
because you have a better idea of what you want to get out and what I want to hear. All these stories are great.
Well, one of my first experiences was going out and catching diamondback rattlesnakes. Um, there was a guy named Lou Hunter who lived over in Palatka, which is a little town in Central Florida. Um, he was notorious for catching some of the biggest rattlesnakes. He lived on Georgia Pacific property and would catch them. So one day he asked me, he said, "When you want to come over and to my house and we'll go over and see what we can find." And so we first day out there, we get out and there's this big piece of property that was called 10,000 acres. And we would go out, we went out there, and so I'd heard about all these humongous rattlesnakes that Lou Hunter, brought in. He brought some in that were, 6 feet long, were regular snakes for him. But he brought, we got out there and we started walking along, and all of a sudden he said, "Mark, come here quick." And so I went running over there, and he said, "I want you to see this. These are some of the biggest blackberries I have ever seen in my life." I just knew for sure he had the biggest diamondback. But so here it was Lou Hunter, this famous snake hunter, eating blackberries by the handful, and I just knew we were going to find a big rattlesnake. But we went on another day and we caught two diamondback rattlesnakes, and the temperature was 13 degrees the day
Wow.
that we caught those two. But one of my favorite stories involves my wife. She was my girlfriend at the time. She lived in a little town in Central Florida called Green Cove Springs. It was north of Palatka. It was about 45 miles from the alligator farm, but we had been dating. So, Ross had brought the deal where we were paying $5 a foot for rattlesnakes. So here's my girlfriend drove over 45 minutes, and her brother had caught a rattlesnake and put it in a burlap sack and drove all the way from Palatka to bring me this snake so he could make $20. So she had a little Datsun, it was a Datsun before Nissan, little hatchback, and she said Billy's snake is in the car. So I went out there and lifted the back up, nothing in the bag. So I said, "Do you have a mirror with you for a makeup mirror?" And she said, "Yeah, why?" And I said, "I need it." So by this time, the doors were open on the car. All the doors were open, and people were coming into the alligator farm and starting to get a little crowd of people around there. So I took the mirror, looked up under the seat, and 6 inches from her leg was this 4 foot diamondback rattlesnake curled up right at the back of her leg. And who knows how far she drove with that snake there. So we took it, and then several people had come out and to the parking lot from the farm, and so we fished the snake out from under the seat. You can imagine what it is trying to get a rattlesnake out from underneath the car seat with all the springs and the wires, and
Yeah.
here's a snake that could kill you. And we got it fished out, and I was standing there holding the snake by its tail, holding it up, and somebody said, "Catch Darlene." So she started fainting. She realized what was going on. So I was holding the snake in one hand and Darlene in the other hand. So that was a fun story. I can imagine a lot of people with a rattlesnake under the seat of their car.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's a
No.
lot
And
of other fun stories that came about this, and I mentioned the name Kent Vliet a while ago, and Kent introduced me to a lot of people that would become great herpetologists and other people that were involved with Kent, and that's how I got to know Walter Offenberg. I don't know if you knew Walter Offenberg or had heard of him, but he was the Komodo dragon specialist, and he took his family and they lived studying Komodo dragons, and he wrote several books on Komodo dragons and Gray's monitor lizards. But he was the authority, and he was telling us stories about him hunting in the olden days, and he said he used to smoke cigarettes, and he was riding on the hood of a car with a lantern trying to catch snakes, and so he was smoking, and he somehow got kerosene on his. He got bitten first of all by something, but he had a bandage on his hand, and the kerosene was on his hand, and his hand caught on fire riding down the road, trying to trying to catch reptiles. But he was Walter Offenberg was a great guy that I got to know through Kent too.
no, sir. And that's one of those things where no, I wasn't aware of him, but
Yeah, if
how?
you look up Walter Offenberg, he's quite a he was quite a guy. Of course, he's no longer with us, but he did a lot of work with the monitors and alligator research. And there's a monitor lizard that has his name attached to it now. And as a matter of fact, when the alligator farm I was there, and we had our 100th anniversary, and I had him come, and he was our keynote speaker. We had a big festivities, and he came, and I was able to speak there. And then Dr. Offenberg came up and spoke afterwards, and there were zoo people from all over the country that were there that had never met him, and they were like in awe because there were people from the New York Zoological Park and some other famous herpetologists had shown up that had never met him, and they couldn't believe that Walter Offenberg was there.
Yes, sir, yeah. Well, and again, it's just how cool is that? Where I'm guilty of no, sir, I didn't know his name off the top of my head by any means, and how cool is that the integral part that person played in where we are now, and just what an interesting person in general, right? To be riding on the hood of a vehicle with a lantern and catching your hand on fire. That's
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
yeah, it is. But we drove. Kent Vliet had an old VW bus, little microbus thing, and there were probably 6 or 8 of us piled in this old van, riding out along the St. Johns River, road hunting for snakes, and Dr. Offenberg telling stories. And we'd see a corn snake, and we'd get out and pick him up, or we'd Dr. Offenberg was going through the creeks, took his shoes off and walking in these creeks at nighttime. And if you went out in some of these creeks, at McCullough Creek and Tocoy Creek out west of St. Augustine, beautiful, beautiful creeks, but it is as dark as it can be dark in these old creeks. And he was wandering along with, you know, grabbing water snakes and pitching them out with this, you couldn't even see, but those were some fun memories.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's so interesting hearing, the generations before us, and how they were handling these situations. And so often I'm sat here going like, man, these guys were madmen.
Oh yeah,
And just how cool it is, right?
yeah,
How soft we've gotten over time.
yeah, yeah. So if you want, we can sort of jump forward a little bit because this will tie back in with some of the things I was telling you about earlier.
Yes, sir. Yeah, let's do it.
But when I was at the alligator farm, we did a lot of neat things. We bought Arthur Jones again, that invented the Nautilus weightlifting equipment. He had a farm called Jumbo Lair that was over in near Ocala, but he had the second largest runway in the state of Florida at the time. He brought in elephants from Africa. He converted these planes over to can bring elephants. And at one time, I think he had as many as 90 elephants at his Jumbo Lair ranch. But his motto, Arthur Jones's motto, was bigger crocodiles, younger women, and faster airplanes. And he had all of the above. But he had 707s, and he converted to haul these elephants. And again, that goes back to me and the Nautilus T-shirt. But while I was in San Augustine, we actually purchased Arthur's crocodile collection, and that was quite an experience during my life because I was the manager of the alligator farm at that time. I had grown over the years and became the manager, but we purchased part of that Jumbo Lair ranch with the crocodiles, and that was quite an experience. We moved Gomek, which is the biggest crocodile. He was 17 plus feet and weighed almost 2 tons. We purchased him as part of that acquisition, but they had a lot of great crocodiles. But we kept it for a long time. We called it our Ocala Crocodilian Center. And Kenny Ernest, who came from the California Alligator Farm, ran that for us. And he stayed over there, and we kept it running for a while. But we finally decided we needed to, move on from that. So we brought a bunch of crocodiles from there, the ones we really wanted, like some of the gharials and some of the more rare things we brought over to San Augustine. But it was a scramble. We moved uh, thousands and thousands of alligators, and nobody got hurt till the very end. Really, it was minor, but Greg Lapira got bitten by the one of the last alligators that we were moving. It bit him on one hand, and he got one hand out, and it turned around and bit the other hand, and that was the last experience of that of that move. But it was quite a scramble. I had a friend come down from Atlanta with the pickup truck and a trailer, and he would come every weekend. He would drive down, and they'd go over and load up crocodiles. We'd bring them from there. I called Tom Crutchfield, and Tom came up numerous times. I don't know how many caiman he took to his place, but and Tom may not even know. But we any crocodile that we didn't want in San Augustine, I pretty much said, Tom, you can take them. And so there was one crocodile there named Bottomless, and Bottomless was a man killer. And we said we don't need him in San Augustine. We don't have anybody here that can handle him. And I think Tom probably ended up with Bottomless, but we did. It was quite an experience moving all that stuff over there. So this was all at the same time that the alligator farm was having its 100th anniversary, and all this was all going on at the same time that we moved all these animals. But that led to the San Augustine Alligator Farm being the first facility to have all the living species of crocodilians in one location. So we sort of jokingly said, I sort of know how Carl Caulfield felt with his rattlesnakes. We were able to, on a much smaller scale, to have every species of crocodile. Since we did it, they've found several new species, but they're all there. But if you ever want to see every living crocodilian in the world, you just go to St. Augustine, Florida.
That's very cool. And no, sir, I haven't been there, but it's definitely making me want to check it out. And when I do, we'll go in with so much more appreciation than I would have before, for
Well, and
sure.
it's a great place. They've now we created this underwater habitat for Gomic, and that was another with all this stuff going on at the same time. I felt like the little man on the Ed Sullivan show with all the plates that were spinning on the. Again, I'm talking about Ed Sullivan, who a lot of people listening to this probably don't even know who he was, but it was this little man that had a stick with about 20 sticks with plates, and he spun them all on the plates and spun the plates on the end of these sticks, and he was running back and forth across the stage trying to keep the plates spinning. And that's sort of how I felt, because trying to keep Ocala getting the Gomic exhibit, getting Gomic's transfer, all that stuff going all at the same time, and getting the exhibit built. But the exhibit's still there, but they have another pair of crocodiles in there that are not as large as Gomic, but they now have a Gomic Forever exhibit. They sent him off to have him taxidermied, so they have a Gomic permanently stuffed in a really nice exhibit with a lot of New Guinea artifacts from where Gomic came from. And if you ever get there, you'll enjoy seeing it. They got a video playing in there of us when we were catching Gomic, bringing him over, and we had to lift him up with a crane because he weighed 2,000 pounds, and we lifted
Jeez.
him up and put him in with the crane. And I got a lot of really good photographs of us moving Gomic.
Wow. Well, that's so cool. And especially again to be in those moments. And then now again, how, the generations moving forward um, will see those animals and their knowledge and interest in these animals will grow from that. And the drastic change that's made in the hobby over time, right? Where we can sit here and something you brought up earlier was, critiquing the way that early keepers were running a business or handling animals, and you know we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that, and you can see that now that a place like the facility you're speaking about will do more for the conservation and care of reptiles over time than I'll ever do, and that's very cool and very important.
Well, we had so many neat things that happened, not just because of that, but David also had the foresight. There was another alligator farm in St. Augustine. It was called Gatorland. It went through a lot of transformations over the years. It was Casper's alligator farm, ostrich farm. There were a lot of ostrich and alligator farms in Northeast Florida during those times, and so David, it was a very poorly run place later on, and animals weren't cared for well, and It was one of the typical old roadside attractions. So people were coming to St. Augustine, and they'd always stop there and think that they were stopping at our place, and they would go back and tell their friends, "Don't go there. That's a rundown place." So David ended up buying the old Gatorland facility, and we closed it down and moved a lot of the animals that were in there to. There was nothing there that we really wanted, because the animals, a lot of them had missing teeth, missing eyes, missing legs, tails. And so I had a friend of mine, Tracy Howell, come up from Plant City, and he owned an alligator farm, and he came and was gladly took them, and we pretty much gave him all the alligators out of there. But it was the thing that was Gatorland was notorious for. There was a very large concrete structure that stood out in front of it, 20 feet plus. Don't know how many 1,000 pounds this thing weighed, but it was smoking a cigar in its hand. And so we were going to donate it to the University of Florida, but it ended up going to Jacksonville, and they were going to put it at the Gator Bowl. But they decided it wasn't appropriate for the Gator Bowl because Florida Georgia plays their football games there. So it's still standing in Metropolitan Park. But every once in a while, I'll read something, and people say, "I wonder whatever happened to that alligator in St. Augustine." And you have to always look at it and say, "Well, I know where it was. I was responsible for moving. I was involved in moving the largest living crocodile and the largest concrete alligator, so, all at the same time."
That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. Well, very cool. Something you'd brought up was talking about a story that was towards the end there with Mr. Ross Allen, after you said maybe after his passing. Was there anything in between that we should talk about before that,
Oh,
or
I'm sure there's a lot. Being in that business, just like Ross, Ross, as I mentioned earlier, Ross did a lot of movie stunts and was in, Tarzan Finds His Son. Johnny Weissmuller would jump in the water, and Ross would jump in the water, and he would become Johnny Weissmuller wrestling alligators. And I guess in that profession, it's a great thing, because not just anybody wants to do that or can do it, but a lot of people find it unique. And we were able to make a living off of it all those years. But it was always people coming in and wanting to. There were movies that were filmed that they would say, "Can you help with it?" And so there were several films that were filmed in St. Augustine, and it was always fun. I went to Okefenokee and did a presentation. They wanted me to come and speak at Okefenokee Swamp Park's 50th anniversary, so I went up and did a couple of talks up there for their 50th anniversary. And then they filmed a movie in Jacksonville. Funny story. A couple of funny stories came out of that. It was starring Timothy Dalton and Brooke Shields in this movie. And Timothy Dalton later on became, one of the James Bonds, but everybody knows Brooke Shields. But one day, one of they were old women that ran their gift shop in there, and they would kid me and tell me, "Oh, Brooke Shields, you're going to run off with Brooke Shields and leave Darlene," because we'd just got married. And I said, "No, I'll be okay." They'd always kid me about me and Brooke Shields in this movie. So one Sunday afternoon, I went home and ate lunch, and the phone rang, and it was Julia in the gift shop. And she said, "Mark, Brooke Shields is here to see you." And I said, "Yeah, right." And so I sort of finished eating my lunch casually, and I walk back. I pull up in the parking lot, and I walk up to the front, and they said, "She's right over there." And it was her and her mom and a couple of other people had been standing there all this time waiting on me to come back to the farm. But I thought she was playing a joke on me. But we went, and Greg LaPera and I went up and did some things for this movie. It's called Brenda Starr. It was sort of a flop of a movie, but they did they did a lot of nature things in the Amazon, and they used Jacksonville primarily because Jacksonville looked like New York City back in the olden days. So they found places that they could use, and they used the St. Johns River and Black Creek as the Amazon, and we took birds and things up there. But one of the funny things is that this guy brought this antique airplane up there, and they wanted us to perch some birds on the wing so it looked like they were in the Amazon. And there were a couple of macaws. So the birds sat there, and while they were filming other scenes, we happened to go back over there, and the macaws had chewed the wooden struts on this man's vintage airplane, and there was splinters laying all over the runway where they had chewed it. And I don't think he could fly the plane to get it out of there. But but it was fun. Greg and I had a lot of fun that day. Henry Gibson, the old laughing Henry Gibson, was in the movie, and we got pictures with him, and just some of the fun things we did like that. I one time went down to Gainesville, to Orlando. There was a TV show called The Adventures with Superboy, and it was Clark Kent when he was a boy, and Lois when she was a young girl. But they had me come down and bring a rattlesnake, and they were walking through the woods in Florida, and the scene was Lois jumped over the fence, and Clark was right behind her. So when she jumped over the fence, there was a rattlesnake curled up and right next to her leg. And of course, they had a piece of plexiglass, and the rattlesnake was on the other side of the plexiglass. And of course, it was rattling and and struck at her. And so Clark jumped over the fence afterwards. And of course, he saw the rattlesnake, and then that's where I came into play. I was Superman's right arm, and I reached down and grabbed the rattlesnake. And the line was, it, I had to bring the rattlesnake up within 6 inches of his face. And I guess the guy that played Superman had never seen a rattlesnake before. But the line was, "Shh, not much going on around here." So I brought the rattlesnake up to in front of his face. This part's not on camera, of course. And he said, "Shh," but I'm not going to finish what he finished saying. And, and but it was sort of funny. So then they cut away. Of course, nobody knows it was me, but it was my hand in front of his face, and then he threw this rubber snake off into the woods. But it was a funny scene with that. But when you do that kind of stuff, there's always movie scenes that come along, and people want you to do things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it gets back to the same thing that came up earlier with Mr. Jeff Adams was talking about the color of life, and you know, you're Superman, right?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
that's more than I can say.
The worst part about it is, and it's one of those things I think back about, is they sent me a check for doing it. I forgot how much they paid me. It was several $100s, but they wrote me a check, and I got it. And in the memo in the bottom, I can remember it said Superman, Superman double, and had my name on it.
Hell
And
yeah,
like,
dude.
tell me why I did not make a photocopy of that, or just not even cash the check,
Yeah.
because that would be so neat to have that framed hanging in my room.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good line for the rest of your life.
That's
By
right.
the way, I'm
That's right.
Superman.
Yeah.
Well, that's excellent. That's excellent. That's so funny. And this is one of those things where every time when I'm going through editing these or listening to them later on, I go, man, there's a million other things I should have asked this. I should have asked that. So
Mhm.
this is definitely something that I would love to run back with you in the future if you ever want to do it again. And anything pops in your head where you go, oh, we should have talked about this or that. I'm always down to do this again, and
Well,
I
great.
appreciate your time so much today.
Can I tell you two more quick stories?
I want to hear him.
Okay. One of them was back to the Ross Allen story. I told you about my later visit in life, and I feel this story is incomplete without telling this. But so last year, my wife and I we were back in St. Augustine, and I said, let's go to Ocala and find Ross's grave. That's sort of weird to go and find somebody's grave, but I wanted to go find his grave. And so I went and did some research, and I found out where Ross is buried in Ocala. So we're on our way there. Ross used to hate when there's a I don't know what you know about turtles, but there's a turtle called a musk turtle, but it's commonly
Yeah,
called a
yes, sir.
stink pot.
Yes, sir.
And Ross hated that word stink pot. He said, I hate when people call that turtle a stink pot. So we were driving on Highway 207 headed to Ocala, real rural farmland to potatoes and stuff. So it was sort of a cool day. Matter of fact, it was wintertime. Driving along the road of all things. And I look and I said, oh, there's a turtle. So we drove down the road, turned around, went back to see what it was. And guess what it was?
It was a musk turtle.
It was a musk turtle. So I told Darlene, I said, I'm taking that guy with me. So I took him over to the cemetery where Ross is buried. I went down and talked to Ross for a little bit. And it was just so happened there was a lake down there. So I said, Ross, I caught you a stink pot. And so I turned it loose there by the pond. So I called it stink pot. He probably wouldn't have approved of it, but I did. But last one couple of things I do want to mention though. Last week I went down to Florida again to see. Actually went to a thing where they were selling Florida souvenirs, and I went to this thing to buy. I was hoping to find some more Ross Allen things, and I did. I found a couple of pennants and some things that I didn't have, and it was great because I got to go by and see my old friend George Van Horn. I don't know if you know who George is, but he worked for Bill Haast a long time ago. But he's sort of a legendary cobra handling person. But he's been bitten by king cobras several times, and I got to visit him, and he gave me a snake hook and one of his snake hooks, and so I got that and Ross's, and I'm gonna get it framed, and I've got a couple of other things like that, and then we went over and saw Carl Barden, who owns the Reptile Discovery Center in DeLand. He's a really neat guy too. He has a venom laboratory called MedToxin, and we got to hang out with him for a little bit and watch him. He had a venom extraction show, but a couple of really good places. If you're ever in Florida, you could spend a lot of time going and seeing these places, but just fun. And then, like I said, we went up to Silver Springs, and they got a little Ross Allen exhibit. They, matter of fact, where the Reptile Institute used to be, there's an island there that's called Ross Allen Island. And in the museum, they've got a bunch of Ross's artifacts hanging in there. I didn't want to tell them that my exhibit at my house was better than theirs, but I do have a lot of things in there that they don't have. But it was great having a reunion at the alligator farm. When I got finished, we went back to San Augustine and got to spend some time with David Drisdell again and with Greg, and got some pictures made with Gomick Forever, and just a lot of memories and stories.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, no, it's been unbelievably cool getting to speak to you and to hear all of this and learn all this. And again, I hope we do it again in the future. I hope you have other stuff that pops into your head that you go, oh, I want to talk about this, and we get to follow up because this has been very educational for me. I've
Most
learned a lot of
definitely.
history that I didn't know necessarily, and I've appreciated getting to speak to you very much. And thank you so much for your time today.
I love talking about my old buddy Ross, so anytime.
Let me zoom out on you here. Okay, you got a message for the time capsule?
Yeah, and it's simply this. My prediction for you is that even though you'll forget all about this in some way consciously, next summer at about this time, you'll remember to return.